All right, well, good afternoon and welcome to the Sped Basics webinar. My name is Megan Alderson and I am the Program Quality Specialist for the DC Special Education Cooperative. In today's Sped Basics webinar, the topic is the IEP and the IEP team. So we're really just going to go through all of the basic components of the IEP, give you a sense of what the purpose of those components are, and then at the end, we're going to take a look at who exactly are the people who are required to be on the IEP team and what roles they play. So in this session, like I said, we're going to do two things. We're going to identify the required components of the IEP, and then we're going to identify the required IEP team members. So we really should start out answering this question: what is the IEP? So if you're not familiar with what an IEP is, or you've just heard it before but not very clear, you can think of it, kind of broken down into these three parts. First and foremost, it's a plan for a child with a disability. It's developed and reviewed and revised at least annually. So at least once a year it has to be reviewed, changes need to be made according to progress or lack thereof. And this development, review, and revision happens with the appropriate team members, and these team members are defined in the law that governs the development of the IEP for any student. So very quickly, you need to understand by law what the IEP has to have. So the first most important thing it has to have is what we call present levels of functional and academic performance. This is the section where we narrate and describe exactly how the student's disability affects their involvement in the general education curriculum. So we state, after we've determined that the child does have a disability that affects their education, we need to explain how it is that the disability does that. What are the particular strengths and weaknesses that we see, and how do those weaknesses impact a child's access to their education? Also, it's important to remember that when we're speaking of the general education curriculum, we're talking about the same curriculum used for their non-disabled peers. For preschool students, it's a little bit different because for preschool students, it's describing how the disability affects their progress and involvement in just what we consider age-appropriate activities. So we're not really thinking about particular curriculums in terms of, math standards and writing standards and reading standards, but more in the sense of socially, emotionally, communication-wise, and cognitively, how the disability is affecting the child. The information that is used for the present level comes from multiple data sources, and that data actually also includes parental input. The IEP also must include a statement of measurable annual goals, and these can be academic and functional goals, and these goals are developed and designed to meet the child where they are, to meet the child where they need to be met as a result of the disability. So the team uses multiple data sources to determine strengths and weaknesses, and we said that those are outlined in the present level of functional and academic performance, and then the goals are developed accordingly. So the goals are developed to address the student's needs. Those multiple data sources might include tests, work samples, student input, observations, parent input. We also are required to see in an IEP a description of how their progress toward meeting annual goals will be measured. So once the goals have been developed by the team actually has to outline, okay, this is the particular goal, or these are the particular goals, and for each individual goal, what is going to be the expectation in terms of collecting data and reviewing progress? Will we use tests? Will we use quizzes, student journals, writing samples, behavior sheets? How are we going to consistently, and what are the methods that are we going to consistently use and look at in order to determine student progress? The IEP also has to state when periodic reports on that progress are going to be reported to families. And so the standard for that is that information has to be shared with families and reported at the same time as all general education reports go out. So usually what we see is that these reports go out when report cards go out. Most schools operate on a quarterly basis, but some schools operate on a trimester. So as long as this reporting is occurring at the same time and at the same rate as the gen ed reporting gets reported to families, then that is perfectly okay. We also have to include a statement of the special education and related services and the supplemental aids and services that are going to be provided to the child. So here's where the team actually describes any tangible supplements that the child will need to support their access to education. This could be where we state the student needs a dedicated aid. Could be where we state the student needs very specific assistive technologies. So here's where we outline the tangible things that need to be available to the student in order to provide them access to the general education curriculum. We also then have to explain any time that is spent outside of the general education curriculum, why the team made that decision. And so this sort of is what we call explaining the least restrictive environment for the student. So how did the team decide the services that would be provided and the specialized instruction time that would be provided away from the general education peers? Or any time outside of just the plain general education environment. So, for example, if you have a child who's going to spend an hour a week outside of the gen ed classroom for speech and language therapy, the IEP has to explain why that is the most appropriate setting for the student. By law, the IEP also has to state any individual appropriate accommodations that are going to be necessary to measure their academic achievement and functional performance on state and district-wide assessments. So these are the accommodations that gen ed teachers usually receive in some form of IEP snapshot or IEP at a glance. But these are accommodations that, people generally understand that need to be used all the time for a particular student. And the rationale is these items will provide them, or accommodations will provide them access to the testing environment, to the testing situation that will provide more valid and reliable data about what the student is able to do. So using calculators when appropriate, having text read aloud to them, except during a reading test, obviously. If a student needs large print materials, that is an accommodation. If a student needs a scribe, if they need extended time, if they need to be tested individually. All of these are examples of accommodations that might be required for a student to test successfully. We also, when we're dealing with services, we need to outline the actual frequency, duration, and location of those services. So if we're saying that a child needs X amount of time in a specific setting, we need to explain exactly how frequent, how long, and where. So, for example, we might have services that are once a week, or twice a month, or daily. Duration could be 30 minutes, 2 hours, 8 hours. And location would be general education or outside general education. Last but not least, there's a point in the IEP process where if the student is about to reach what we call age of majority, they need to be made aware of what their rights are. And so the student has to be informed that the procedural safeguards that are usually afforded to the parents can and do transfer to them at the age of majority. So they have to be informed at least 1 year ahead of time about this. Most states, the age of majority is 18. In my research, I came across, I think, about 2 states, 3 max, where the age of majority was different, which usually was 21. So now that we know we've got a briefing on what all the actual components are, there are very specific team members that the law requires to be a part of the IEP team. The general education teacher. This is the team member who acts or serves as the expert in regard to what are the expectations of students at a particular grade level in the general education curriculum. What do the standards say that they should be able to do, so that the discussions at the table can be around, if this is what the child should be able to do, what parts of this are they doing, what parts of this are they not doing, and how do we bridge that gap? The special education teacher acts as the expert on the methods and strategies that can be used for a student to provide them appropriate access to the gen ed curriculum. So what accommodations would be appropriate based on the strengths and weaknesses of the student, what organizational methods could be put in place, all those kind of things. So this is based on a very specialized knowledge of how to accommodate and modify curriculums and environments for students with disabilities. The parent, who I would argue is probably the most important team member, because they are the team member who we expect should know the child best, and therefore they should have equal input into the IEP development process. It is expected that an LEA representative be on the team and attend the meeting. This is the person who upholds the policies and procedures enforced by the school or school district. So this should be an administrator, a principal, or other designated representative. In some schools, you might have a special education director who acts as the LEA representative. Some schools, come to the conclusion that there should be, especially when you have multiple campuses, there should be a principal and a special education director or coordinator at the meeting, so that everybody knows what is involved for a student. Finally, there should be an individual qualified to conduct assessments. So these include any individuals whose assessments or involvement in the eligibility process have led to or will lead to the provision of related services. So if speech and language testing was done and it was determined that the student had a speech and language impairment that was, impacted educationally by the disability, then a speech and language pathologist should be at the meeting. A speech and language pathologist should then be writing the goals for those services. Same for occupational therapists or any other related service providers who could be involved. So that is the pretty basic glance of what the IEP is, what is a part or what must be a part of the IEP, and those team members who are involved in the process. If at any time you have any questions, here are the contacts that you can reach out to at the DC Special Education Cooperative. We are happy at any time to answer questions. Feel free to be in touch. And that is all. So I hope you enjoyed this webinar. I hope you found it informative, and definitely reach out if you would like some more in-depth information.